Hi everyone, welcome to week 6, module number 7, the content-based lecture on representing race, Black African American U.S. women artists, and feminism. A couple of words before we start off on the lecture to kind of frame things. The first, I suppose, is to say that we've got a number of issues when it comes to the terminology that we're going to be using here. For instance, race, of course, some of you will be well aware, is a contested term these days in that, it's so closely tied to the idea of a kind of biological necessity that many people have been pointing out that race is a categorical construct more than anything else. And one of the surest ways that you can see this is to note that there is no kind of purity of the various races, that when we start to look at them carefully, we see that the things that really matter when we're talking about race don't have much to do with genetics or even skin pigmentation or facial features or such, but all of the values that accrue to those things. So, even though I will be using the term race, maybe ethnicity would be a better term for this category of inquiry. The second thing to note is that while we are just looking this quarter at Black African American women and men, there's no reason that in a longer course we wouldn't look at other ethnicities and races as well. There's plenty of very interesting work done by Asian artists, by artists of Latino descent and Latina descent, Hispanic cultures, Muslim cultures, and so forth. It's primarily an issue of time, being able to go into depth on a more narrow field of inquiry rather than trying to cover everything, as well as the fact, and it's worth noting, that this is an area that I've spent a lot of time in my own life looking into, and so it comes from my own area of expertise as well. The other thing I wanted to note right off the bat is that we are following the trajectory of gender here into race. In other words, we've looked at feminist artists and gender, and now we're looking at the representation of gender plus race. While if we were to follow this more chronologically, we would start with the Black male artists who are a bit more visible, going all the way back to the Harlem Renaissance of the 20s, all the way through the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and so forth. Then were their female counterparts. We will return to the question of race when it comes to male artists next week and get a little bit more historical backdrop to this story than we'll be getting today. So with that being said, then, let's start with this. As many of the readings will note, there's a fairly common trajectory when it comes to identity politics and representation in the arts, one which starts from artists claiming a certain kind of essentialist quality among shared experiences or even biological essentialism, and then extending to a moment in which that kind of essentialism is critiqued, as we saw in the second generation of feminist artists, by the idea of identity being more a construct rather than something that is essential. Now, when it comes to race and its intersection with representation, particularly with Black culture, there's far less of an interest in claiming some kind of essential qualities to one's own race, primarily because historically those types of genetic inquiries have led to prejudices against people of various races or various ethnicities. In other words, if you were to look through the history of sociological, if you can even call that, analysis from the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, more often than not, those inquiries are, whether they intended to or not, prejudice against people of color, treating them as lower in the evolutionary stage of, cultural development and even kind of racial development than majority white culture would be. However, with that being said, from the time of the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s through the civil rights movement, many artists of color, particularly Black artists, oftentimes looked at precedents for their own culture in African culture, So what you're looking at on the screen here is a work by a very early female artist, Lois Mailou Jones, called Les Fétiches, or The Fetishes. Mailou Jones came kind of on the tail end of the Harlem Renaissance. She continued to practice for over 50 years and is a very kind of well-known artist in the field. And like so many of the artists of her age, she sought to revitalize the connections of post-colonial Black culture, so cultures after, of course, slavery, to their precedents in African culture. This, is even more complex than we see here. She's basically taken African masks and used them as the basis for a modernist abstractionist work, in that she was also kind of contesting some of the ways that these African masks and masks that were deemed to come from primitive cultures were being used by modern abstractionist painters such as Picasso and Matisse, that took them out of their context and just treated them as aesthetic objects rather than something that harked back to common experiences. So we see that, for instance, here again in a much later work from 1982 by Lois Mailou Jones, seeking out connections of contemporary Black experience and Black, in this case, ethnic traditions, such as the beautification of the body, or in this case, the interest in various hairstyles. This work is called Two African Hairstyles. By showing you an ancient sculpture from African culture on the top, next to a young Black woman who is adopting these beautiful hairstyles as well, showing these kinds of ways that Black culture had resisted complete colonization or, a kind of assimilation into the so-called melting pot of American culture by continuing their traditional practices of beautification, in particular hairstyles here. One of the common things that you might think about is during the 50s, in particular, and 60s, the prevalence of kente cloth in African cultures, which was another way for contemporary Blacks to look back at precedents in African cultures for some of the ethnic forms, cultural forms, that they continued to employ in their own lives. This isn't so dissimilar, I might note, to, for instance, Carolee Schneemann and Mary Beth Edelson seeking out precedents in matrilineal cultures, right? Those cultures that predate the contact with patriarchy. In this case, it's cultures that predate the colonization of Africa, or the taking of Black Africans, primarily West Africans, as slaves, through the ages. We jump forward quite a bit in time here to look at a work by Betty Saar called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima from 1972, to a period of Black artists, women artists, pointing out some of the stereotypes that they confront every day in their own lives, and the persistence of these stereotypes from antebellum times up until the present. This is roughly coextensive with the second generation of feminist artists, but unlike those feminist artists who are seeking to deconstruct these stereotypes according to kind of, postmodern, post-structuralist ideas taken out of French critical theory and so forth, these artists go at this question a little bit more straightforward. What Betty Saar is doing here is something that became known as representing the stereotypical grotesque. The stereotypical grotesque is taking stereotypes of, in this case, Black culture, and pushing them so far into their insidious extreme that we can't help but notice them. They can no longer kind of hover beneath the surface of our experience, and instead we have to confront them straight on. In this case, then, what we see is an artist taking something that is very common and seems, fairly neutral, Aunt Jemima syrup, for instance, and noting the way that that figure that we see every day on that syrup bottle actually goes back to a common stereotype of Black women. In this case, Aunt Jemima is what is known as a mammy figure. Mammy may be most familiar to those of you who saw Gone with the Wind or read the book, but they're everywhere to be found. The mammy figure, of course, is the Black woman who after slavery was oftentimes hired by the same people who formerly had held these people as slaves to provide the same functions that she held under slavery in taking care of the white children and taking care of the house, and then became an icon of this syrup, something that I don't think many of us recognize as being racist in any way. You just think, wow, here's this black woman on this syrup bottle. It's all just a mark of the syrupy goodness of of this product or something of that sort. But these forms, of course, have deep resonances into the past. So what is the problem with the mammy figure? Well, for those of you who don't know what she represents, she's oftentimes this incredibly kind of passive woman. She doesn't have any anger at all about her predicament within this totally inequitable situation. She continues to be nice and happy and take care of the children without any anger being shown, despite her social circumstances. So she's a kind of passive, she represents a kind of passive acceptance of her own inequitable situation. So what we see here changing this then is in the background, of course, you have the repetition of the stereotype, and we have noted that repetition is a favorite form of stereotypes, as the woman who is passive, who is neutral. But then in front of her we have the stereotypical grotesque, a 3D figure who is just one stereotype after another stereotype of black culture. Completely black face, like as black as you can get, big, huge red lips, very, very white eyes, incredibly colorful outfit and so forth, pushing then that stereotype beyond its acceptance, and then accompanying that stereotype with something that is supposed to represent black power or an alternative to this passive figure, the idea of militancy. Now, when she made this work in the 70s, of course, the Black Power movement was at its apex. This is, of course, a movement that came about in the civil rights movement, but really reached its zenith with the Black Panthers group as a kind of militant form here, saying we're not just going to be these pacifist kind of resistors to white culture that is most commonly represented by the great Dr. Martin Luther King's own peaceful protests, but more in line with the idea of we're not putting up with it anymore, and if it takes kind of militant action or actually doing something physical about it, then we will do that. And so she's accompanied by a couple of different firearms here. In the belly of the figure, you see a kind of crazed-looking mammy figure holding a screaming white child, and in front of that, the famous Black Power salute fist in the foreground that was made, kind of universally known in 1968 when two sprinters in the Olympics, when they won their medals, stood on the podium and instead of just kind of, singing the national anthem, raised their hands in the Black Power salute. Then beneath her feet are kind of cloud forms, the idea of the mythology of this whole stereotype, but also something that all references as well the cotton that was picked by slaves and the persistence of these imagery and that kind of, difficult history into the present. So one of the things that this makes me think about, and it is a really worthwhile area to think about for you as well, I believe, is what do we do when we come across kind of persistent cultural forms that one group finds incredibly offensive, or even a subgroup within that group finds offensive, such as the stereotype of the mammy figure as the black woman per se, where the rest of us just see, let's say, a syrup bottle. What do you do when you walk through the grocery and you see an Aunt Jemima syrup bottle? Do you take that as racist? Do you acknowledge that some people take that as racist? And what do you do with that information? Another place to think about this is, for instance, in the ways that most kind of notably I suppose. Various athletic teams continue to have fairly racist names. The most notable is, of course, the Washington Redskins football team. In today's day and age, how do we hold on to the name Redskin? I know most people think of this as just a team mascot name, but what if it offends a ton of people? What do we do with that information? Another part of Betty Saar's work is an interest in what we saw in Lois Mailou-Jones, which is the idea of Black culture's relation to African cultures. What you're looking at here on the screen, I'm just going over it very briefly, is a work called The Black Girl's Window by Betty Saar. Much of her work, if it's not the stereotypical grotesque, is affirmative, meaning that it seeks to hark back to traditions in African culture and its kind of extension into American African culture as well. And that's what we see here. I'll just read you a little quote here. This is all about Black women's own spirituality and its connection to African roots and African traditions and how those have been modified by contemporary kind of Western spiritual traditions. She said of this work, quote, "There's a black figure pressing its face against the glass like a shadow, and two hands that represent my own fate. On the top are 9 little boxes in rows of 3 marked by the crescent, the star, and the sun in the center, a skeleton. Death is the center. Everything revolves around death. This is a symbolic structure which allows the viewer to look into and gain insight and to traverse the threshold of the mystic world." One last work by Betty Saar here. Again, the stereotypical grotesque. In this case, we've got the mammy figure once again, speaking in kind of broken English, meant to reference the idea of the stereotype of Black culture being undereducated or, not being able to speak the English language as well, and therefore not being qualified to attain equality. One of the major artists for today's lecture is Adrienne Piper. Hopefully at this point you will have read the reading that I provided on the triple negation of the colored woman artist by Adrienne Piper. This is an early work by Adrienne Piper that comes from the Catalysis series, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Adrienne Piper is a Black woman artist who, it's important to note, is of mixed racial heritage. The reason that that's important to note is that she is part, Black, part white. She grew up in a mixed race family, but she's oftentimes mistaken as being a white woman, which leads her to have to confront racism by people who don't know that she's Black and may utter things that are, racially insensitive in front of her. She is also a practicing philosopher. She teaches philosophy at the university. She has a PhD in philosophy, and that's an important component of her work. She's very logical and straightforward about her approach to racism. In the Catalysis series, what Adrienne Piper did is and what you're looking at are photographs from what was, in essence, a long series of performances. She made herself kind of socially unacceptable very overtly so as to experience the way that society dealt with her, as well as the way that she thought of herself in these circumstances. This is pretty common. We saw, for instance, The Bag Lady by Suzanne Lacy, in which someone tries to experience something firsthand to gain insight from it. In this case, she did things such as, you see on the screen, wear a shirt with the words wet paint on it, of course, in actual wet paint, and then walk in society or bump up against people to see how they would respond to her. In another, and this is how these things are displayed, in another performance of the Catalysis series, she soaked a shirt in vinegar and fish oil and all kinds of smelly materials and let it sit for about a week, and then took the subway and the bus around town and tried to experience how people were repelled by her, so as to get this idea of social interactions and what people did when in the proximity of someone that they found repellent. And then, of course, she takes this knowledge with her, charts it off in these incredibly complex notebooks that she keeps, which are now produced and published as facsimiles that anyone can kind of go look at in order to gain some insight on the way that social interactions work when someone is confronted by someone that they find distasteful in one way or another. And she uses this as the basis of her own kind of analysis of social interactions. This is another part of the Catalysis series you will have read about, where she stuffed in her mouth a dishcloth so that her cheeks were huge and bulging, and it kind of, she couldn't fit it all in there, so it's sticking out of her mouth, and then went out in public. Another series that she did, again, this is kind of her in a performance that where she experiences something that then she gains knowledge through, is a series called the Mythic Being series. Since Adrienne Piper believes that race and racism comes from the idea of a kind of set of constructions by which people understand race, she decided to adopt the persona of a mythic being who is a hyper-masculine black male, a kind of embodiment of stereotypes about the angry young black man, and see what it felt like to kind of act in this persona. So, for instance, what you're seeing here on the screen is Adrienne Piper, who is a fairly small, slight little woman who has put on sunglasses and glued on a mustache and is wearing a giant afro, sitting on the sidewalk, catcalling to white women with impunity, right? Acting the part of the kind of angry black man who, because of his own kind of status as a minority figure, is able to be very aggressive and very overt and have a certain amount of power in these situations that are socially unacceptable, but as she says, are allowed because of what she calls white guilt, that people don't want to perhaps say anything back because there's this kind of underlying insidious idea that, that they have a right to act this way because their anger is real, even if it is socially unacceptable. These things not only take the form of performances in everyday life. She often documents these, of course, as photographs that are shown, and she oftentimes publishes these in various newspapers, such as you see here in the screen, a drawing on top of one of her photographs of herself playing the part of the mythic being. One of Adrienne Piper's most famous works is this. It's something that oftentimes starts off any lecture of Adrienne Piper's work. This is one of her many self-portraits. If we stop and we think about what self-portraits are, of course, they are the way that we represent ourselves to ourselves and to the world. They're a form of self-expression and self-representation. What she's done here is drawn herself, but she's drawn herself exaggerating her negroid features. Now stop and think about the importance of this. As a young white, black woman here, mixed-raced woman, she, of course, felt the pull, the kind of pressures put on her by society to play the part of the white woman. After all, this is a more valued, form, and of course this is something that many people have talked about, various races, of trying to make themselves look like the majority culture's ideas of beauty. So as a young black woman, for instance, she would have felt pulled to under-exaggerate her negroid features, straighten her hair, whatever it might be, lighten her skin through powder and so forth, but she resisted those. And later in her life, she is claiming her own Negro identity, her colored identity as she calls it, as her own. She's not letting others represent her. She is representing herself, and that's a form of empowerment. Her self-portraits take a lot of forms. I hope you'll take the time to read through some of this. This is her political self-portrait. Like so many of members of Black culture, one of the ways that, of course, self-representation occurs is through narratives, through writings, through the self-representation of personal experiences that can be shared with other people of one's ethnicity. In this case, she finds herself torn between Black and white culture, and it's a kind of series of remembrances of times that she felt pulled one way or another, and when she was misrecognized as white or over-recognized as Black, and the stereotypes that confronted her. So take some time to look this over. If you can't read this on the screen, look up the political self-portrait and get a bigger image of it and kind of read through it to see what she has to say about her own experience. Now, the way that these things work, of course, is that one can read this as a member of a non-minority culture and gain some insight on the types of situations that this woman found herself in. And also, equally important is, as a member of a minority culture, one can read through this and recognize similar situations that one may have found oneself in their own lives, and gain some insight from that, in the same way that consciousness-raising sessions for the West Coast feminists were so important and continue to be important in many different minority cultures today. This is her self-portrait as a nice white lady, which is funny because, again, if you didn't see the thought bubble with the very ethnic "what you looking at" mofo, you wouldn't maybe recognize what her ethnicity was. It's a form of claiming that ethnicity. And then something that's kind of very personal to me as well. I grew up in as I have mentioned elsewhere, a mixed race family. Although not a mixed ethnic family. My brother's Black, my sister is Native American. So I saw and confronted kind of racism fairly frequently in my life, but of course it was never directed at me. And it was always a little bit difficult to decide what to do with that, how you confront that in your own lives. In this situation, what you're looking at is a series of drawings on usually newspapers called the Vanilla Nightmares series. And what has occurred here is that Adrienne Piper, a very well-read woman, is reading through, in this case, the New York Times in a section that is dealing with South Africa and apartheid, when this was, of course, big news, and there was a lot of pressure put on South Africa to change its political situation. And she reads through this and she finds all kinds of ambivalences in the verbiage, or things that come across as incredibly racist even when they're not meant to be. And she redirects her anger, instead of, in a kind of op-ed piece, dealing with or trying to correct the types of racisms or ambivalences she reads in the paper. She just draws on the paper her own anger, her own kind of frustrations with the system. In this case, part of the frustration may stem from the fact that I've gone back and looked at this particular day of the New York Times, that in the sports section of the same newspaper, which the first 3 pages are all devoted to South Africa and apartheid, we see 2 South African golfers in the lead, and I forget which tournament it was, the Masters or something like that, in the lead there, and no acknowledgement that the course that they were playing on was a course that did not allow Blacks to be members, nor women for that case. And so, it's a kind of finger pointing at South Africa and apartheid without looking internally at the United States or the continuance of forms of prejudice in our everyday world. Or she'll read a in this case, an advertisement for the new safari line and find this incredibly offensive, a kind of form of cultural tourism in which white culture dresses up as if they're going on safari, and it evokes all kinds of ideas about Africa and its exotic nature. And in the background, she draws this powerful black man kind of looming over the white woman in the foreground. Or another advertisement for this, this Perfume Poison, where we see the beautiful white woman in the foreground, and in the background, black men embracing her, or, in one way or another, overpowering her. For her, the black man is, in these images, a representation of kind of the simmering anger that hovers beneath the surface of all types of race relations that have not been dealt with to date. Maybe the easiest to get to is this one, the Amex commercial that, of course, has the tagline, "Membership has its privileges." In this series from the Vanilla Nightmare series, Adrienne Piper shows hordes of black people trying to attain that level of membership and all the privilege that adheres to white culture, only to be denied such things. Those are fairly aggressive forms, and I follow them up with something that is equally important in Adrienne Piper's work. This is a still from a series of performances that she did called the Funk Lesson series that started in the 80s. Funk Lesson series, I'm going to read to you what Adrienne Piper said about this work itself. Was a situation in which she draws together people of various different ethnicities and racial groups in order to learn something about funk music and funk culture. And she does it in a way that is trying to bring together both whites and blacks and other ethnicities in a really congenial atmosphere to come to some kind of communal understanding through the process of dance and learning music. So here's what she had to say about this. From 1982 to 1984, I staged collaborative performances with large or small groups of people entitled Funk Lessons. The first word in the title refers to a branch of popular black music and dance known as funk, in contrast to, for example, punk or rap or rock. Its recent ancestor is called rhythm and blues or soul, and it has been developing as a distinctly cultural idiom within black culture since the early 1970s. Funk constitutes a language of interpersonal communication and collective self-expression that has its origins in African tribal music and dance, and is the result of the increasing interest of contemporary black musicians and the populace in those sources elicited by the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. African tribal drumming by slaves was banned in the United States during the 19th century, so it makes sense to describe this increasing interest as a rediscovery. This medium of expression has been largely inaccessible to white culture, in part because the different roles social dance in white as opposed to black culture. For example, whereas social dance in white culture is often viewed in terms of achievement, social grace, or competence, or spectator-oriented entertainment, it is a collective and participatory means of self-transcendence and social union in black culture along many dimensions, and is so often much more fully integrated into daily life. Thus, it is based on a system of symbols, cultural meanings, attitudes, and patterns of movement that one must directly experience in order to understand fully. This is particularly true of funk, where the concern is not how spectacular anyone looks, but rather how completely everyone participates in collectively shared, enjoyable experience. My immediate aim in staging the large-scale performance, and preferably with 60 people or more, was to enable everyone present to get down and party together. Now, I attended one of these when I was younger, kind of, I think, my senior year in high school or so. at the bequest of my feminist mother, and of course, because of my own, family life. And it was extraordinary. What she does is, it's oftentimes very difficult to talk about racial issues and racial tensions because immediately one feels a little defensive if you're of the majority culture. But in this situation, it's so completely kind of congenial to an atmosphere of shared experience that while she is explaining, for instance, where funk music comes from and how some of the rhythms go all the way back to West African culture and some of the forms of dance are, persistence of various cultural forms that go all the way back to African culture as well. And then she's asking you to, of course, follow her in the footsteps of this dance and do it yourself. You're not thinking about anything other than sharing in the enjoyment of a collective experience, of coming to know another culture and actually participating in that cultural experience rather than feeling like you're having your finger or someone's finger waved at you for not understanding another culture. And so it tends to really draw people in and ends up with a lot of people sharing their own racial biases that they're starting to acknowledge, getting really interested in other cultures, and, is one of the various strategies that she employs in order to draw together a communality of experience. And here's just one more photograph from my own experience of this. That's not me, by the way. But along with that, and with the idea of trying to evoke in people their own some of the prejudices that they might hold at heart that they're unaware of, she does, in this case, installations that are meant to evoke any types of prejudices you might have. What you're looking at here is the black box that holds a series of images known as 4 intruders plus alarm system. So this would be in a gallery space, and you would walk into this black box and see images of blacks, oftentimes lit with strobe lights, very, very kind of overpowering images, very large scale. These are about, 4x4 images that are lit up by these strobe lights. And while you're in there, these kinds of what she calls angry black young men are meant to elicit from you, your own fears and your own prejudices, what you think about blacks without really thinking about it. Your kind of knee-jerk response to confronting someone who looks angry or someone who seems to have it out for you. While you're in there, as well, there's a sound component of this in which recordings of hypothetical situations in which whites are confronted by blacks and feel fear or acknowledge their own prejudices are being played so that you can hear these things and kind of reference your own experience as well. Finally, one of her most famous works, something that has been shown any number of times, is a work called Cornered, which is, you see it set up here, it's an installation work, usually with a table that's overturned in front of a video monitor with seats for you to sit in. The table being overturned is both a reference to the idea of turning the tables on white culture, but also a very kind of aggressive form with these pointy table legs pointed out at you. And while you're seated there, Adrienne Piper is on the screen very nicely and very rationally explaining to the audience how most of us, of course, have some degree of Negro blood or Negro genetics in our own makeup. What she's trying to do is, of course, deflate the idea of racial purity on the one hand, but she's also trying to make us all acknowledge that, the differences between us are not so firm and secure as we believe. One of the things she's also, of course, trying to do is many people out there are really fearful, and historically this has been the case, of the mixing of the races, something that is called miscegenation. And there are plenty of stories of, for instance, people refusing blood transfusions unless they knew that the blood came from another white person, or disacknowledging, their mixed racial heritage, when, of course, most of us have that racial heritage. I'll direct you to YouTube on this. You can go look up various little segments of this video on YouTube. She has pulled the longer segments from YouTube of this work for copyright purposes, and it's her own right to not allow these things out there without her okay, but you can find people redoing this or little segments of this to get a flavor of what this is all about. Finally, again, back to the question of what do we do when we hear someone say something or do something that is racist? How do we confront that? And what is the best way to change someone's belief system, to change them, and to confront racism when we come across it? In her notebooks, Adrienne Piper, as the consummate philosopher, has tested out as many as 15 different approaches to dealing with her confrontation of people who make, a racist remark in front of her, not knowing that she is a black woman or self-identifies as black. And her final kind of resolution of the best way to deal with this are these calling cards, as she calls them, that she does pass out. She carries them with her and passes these out to people when she is confronted by racism as the best way to deal with it. What she thinks in this situation is that a direct confrontation in which you tell someone they're being racist just makes them respond very defensively, and it probably doesn't change their inner way of thinking about race in any real way. They just kind of keep it below the surface, or more aware of when they actually utter a racist remark or have a kind of racist thought. But if she gives them a calling card such as this, maybe they think about that kind of without that confrontation and come to some degree of self-reflection on their own prejudices. So you can read this over, right? Dear friend, I'm black. I'm sure you did not realize this when you made, laughed at, agreed with that racist remark. In the past, I have attempted to alert white people to my racial identity in advance. Imagine what that must sound like. Unfortunately, this invariably causes them to react to me as pushy, manipulative, or socially inappropriate. Therefore, my policy is to assume that white people do not make these remarks, even when they believe there are no black people present, and to distribute this card when they do. I regret any discomfort my presence is causing you, just as I'm sure you regret the discomfort your racism is causing me. Sincerely yours, Adrienne Margaret Smith Piper. Or, in a more kind of straightforward, gendered way, dear friend, I'm not here to pick anyone up or to be picked up. I'm here alone because I want to be here alone. Now, this is the part where guys just simply don't get it, and they will certainly believe that the second sentence is not true. This card is not intended as part of an extended flirtation. Thank you for respecting my privacy. Another approach, of course, and we've seen this all the way through, when we're dealing with someone who is both a woman and is of an ethnic minority, they're doubly marked or doubly marginalized, right? And so, in a way, it's like they're having to confront all the inequities that adhere to both their gender and their race. And you heard Adrienne Piper in the article that I gave you exhorting black women to take more risks. To not play the zero-sum game and so forth. And one example of this might be the work of another black woman artist, Lorraine OGrady, who you see here performing a work called Mademoiselle Bourgeois Noir. This is a performance, and these are all performance stills, in which Lorraine OGrady dressed herself up as a kind of over-the-top beauty princess with this attendant sash that says Mademoiselle Bourgeois Noir. Her outfit is about 360 white gloves, meant to reference the idea of having to play that game of whiteness in order to make it as a artist in the world. And she would show up originally at black artist galleries in order, and particularly during a time period in which abstraction was very much at the fore. So in the 70s and 80s, when black artists were shying away, many black artists anyway, shying away from political activism in their art and just doing these kind of beautiful abstract works, and raised the stakes by exhorting them to remember that, you know, it's not a level playing field, and that playing the game of abstraction was always going to net them a kind of secondary status in the art world. So she shows up, and in addition to making a spectacle of herself, she also, you know, very, very loudly, you know, makes these statements such as, and this is a direct quote, "No more boot licking, no more ass kissing, no more buttering up, no more posturing of super ass emulates. Black artists must take more risks." The whip that you see here is meant to reference the whip that, as she said, made the plantations move. So it's a harking back to black experience and the persistence of the history of slavery in current race relations and in, you know, in the inner consciousness of all people of African descent and slavery. So then, on to another artist of the same time period, Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold first started off as a painter, and then more and more moved into using quilts as her medium. This is a painting known as "The Flag is Bleeding" here. The American flag, of course, is something that is supposed to represent all Americans, but as we'll see a number of times in the lectures this week and next week, many people of color point to the American flag as something that does not represent them. Of course, when I was growing up, the idea was that America was a melting pot and that all of us would live together in equality, and that's what the American flag represented, which is a beautiful idea. But it's not something that really is practiced. It's not, you know, a reality in our world. So in this case, you see the blue of the stars all covering the face of the black man, making him even blacker. And those stars almost look like bars kind of holding him in, whereas over on the other side, the white man is a lot more visible and, of course, is aligned with the white stripes more than anything else. And then in between these two, in these difficult race relations, is the woman who kind of hovers between both. She's neither afforded the status of the angry black man, nor is she allowed into the status of the white man himself. And it's just her way of kind of catalyzing a discussion about the inequities that are in the world in which she lives.